I'm Nora Bennett, 33, and I'm sitting in my grandmother's living room with the lavender scent she loved still clinging to the curtains, while 15 relatives wait for my sister to finish her speech about what's fair. Allison stands near Grandma's wingback chair in a slate suit that gleams under the afternoon light, flipping through a folder the way a conductor readies an orchestra. She does not look at me when she says my name, not at first, not until she mentions numbers that sound less like rent and more like a verdict. My heartbeat falls into step with the old clock on the mantel, steady and stubborn. My chair is the narrow one by the window, the seat I always take because no one else wants it. Outside, the street is quiet. Inside, everyone is waiting for me to nod and accept her terms. I fold my hands, and for once, I don't rush to make anyone comfortable. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who refused to see it. I grew up in this house under June Bennett's careful eye, scraped knees, cleaned at the kitchen sink, coins counted at the table, small lessons tucked into ordinary days. Grandma taught me that kindness is not weakness and that integrity is what you do when no one is paying attention. My parents moved often for work when I was a child, but this place stayed the same: the lemon oil on the banister, the worn runner on the stairs, the perfect square of sunlight that fell on the third step every afternoon. Allison and I were raised to say please and thank you, to return dishes with a note, and to stand straight in photographs. Somewhere along the way, the world rewarded her for being loud and decisive, and rewarded me for being quiet and useful. It didn't bother me. I liked seeing how things worked, what made a building breathe, how a broken boiler could swallow a month's profit, or how a roof repaired well gave everyone a better night's sleep. When I landed an entry-level role at a mid-sized property firm, it felt right. I walked the blocks from the subway to our sites, learned the names of superintendents, peeked into basements that smelled like damp concrete and iron, and watched the market swing like a pendulum. My paycheck was modest, but the work gave me something solid: numbers that added up, plans that could be executed, people who slept easier because a heat line warmed like it should. Allison moved in another world. Polished lobbies, conference rooms, celebratory dinners where the tablecloths were heavy and the wine list had its own leather jacket. She'd glide into family gatherings with headlines in her pocket and an audience at her heels. I'd wipe a speck of dust off Grandma's frame and ask which storm window needed attention before winter. In photographs, she shined. In the edges of those same frames, I held the ladder. Grandma noticed the parts no one else did. On Sundays, when Allison was on yet another call, I sat with Grandma and her envelopes, the ones marked insurance taxes and just in case. She'd slide statements across the table and ask me what I saw. I'd point to line items that didn't match or interest that could be better somewhere else. Buildings tell the truth, she'd say, tapping a column of figures with her pen. People take longer. She never boasted about owning anything. She thought stewardship was a better word than possession, and she liked a scrubbed stairwell more than a fresh coat of paint if it meant the light reached the corners. When the winters got harder on her knees, I learned how to listen for the clank of old radiators and the hum of a new pump, and how to stretch $1 until it covered a repair and a thank you for the man who stayed late to finish it. It was a shock when we lost her, even though we'd been preparing for months. The house felt larger without her voice, and the things she organized started to drift toward Allison's desk: trust papers, certificates of deposit keys labeled in Grandma's careful handwriting. I understood why. Allison had the credentials and the posture people respect in rooms like this. I paid my rent on time for 5 years in the building on Riverside and never asked for a favor. The dishwasher took months to fix once the heat coughed through February another year, but I learned patience called repairs and kept a tidy ledger. I thought that was enough of a contribution. Quiet stability, no fuss, no drama. The people I worked with measured worth in solved problems. The people at our family table measured it in announcements. Allison prefers announcements. After Uncle Mark reminded us we were here to handle final details and to be kind to one another, she smoothed her skirt and shifted the conversation. She thanked everyone for appreciating the unglamorous labor of overseeing family property, her smile precise and camera ready. Then she said she'd been reviewing current market conditions and that my apartment had been subsidized long enough. The word landed with a soft thud in the center of the room. Aunt Linda murmured something about fairness. Kyle stared at his phone and smirked. Allison opened a folder and I watched color-coded tabs catch the light. "Nora," she said finally, looking at me, "your rent will be adjusted to reflect the neighborhood effective next month." She waited for me to nod, the way I always do. I didn't nod. I watched the second hand walk across the clock face and thought of Grandma's pen tapping a margin, her voice saying, "People take longer." I could feel every gaze waiting for the old version of me. The one who stays agreeable signs quickly carries the weight without complaint. Outside, a bus sighed at the curb and pulled away, leaving an easy silence. In it, I heard my own voice, steady and simple, say, "We should not rush paperwork on the same day the terms are announced." Allison raised an eyebrow. The room inhaled, and I folded my hands again to keep them from shaking. She set a lease on the coffee table and slid it my way, the corner brushing against the wood where Grandma once kept her reading glasses. And just as Allison began to point out the page where she wanted my signature, a knock sounded at the front door firm and measured like the start of a different kind of conversation. The knock at Grandma's front door broke the air like the strike of a gavel. Every head in the room turned. Allison frowned, already impatient, but I rose from my seat without waiting for her permission. The air in the living room had grown dense, a mix of lavender and tension. When I reached the door and opened it, sunlight spilled over the porch, catching on the rim of a briefcase clasp. A man in a dark gray suit stood there, calm and composed, holding a leather folder. "Good afternoon, Ms. Bennett," he said evenly. "Daniel Park. Sorry I'm late. Traffic was worse than expected." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. I stepped aside to let him in, and the murmurs behind me began immediately. Aunt Linda whispered something to Uncle Mark. Kyle chuckled under his breath, already typing on his phone. Allison's heels clicked across the hardwood as she moved to intercept. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "This is a private family meeting." Daniel nodded, politely unfazed. "So I understand," he said, setting the folder on the nearest table. "My client requested I deliver some documents regarding her tenancy and property rights." The word "client" sent a visible ripple through the room. I could feel every eye turn toward me. Allison's expression didn't waver. "Nora," she said, measured and dismissive, "what exactly is this?" Her tone was the one she used in depositions, controlled, almost bored. "Just due diligence," I said. "You were asking me to sign a lease today without review. I thought it best to consult someone." She laughed lightly, the sound brittle. "You hired a lawyer for a family discussion." The cousins found that amusing. A few chuckled along. "Not hired," Daniel corrected quietly, opening the folder. "Retained." The difference hung there, subtle but sharp. Allison crossed her arms. "Let's not turn this into a spectacle." But the spectacle had already begun. 15 people in that living room watched a familiar script turn inside out. I wasn't pleading or flustered. I wasn't apologizing. I was standing straight beside a man who spoke my language, the kind measured in contracts, not guilt. Allison gestured toward the lease still lying on the coffee table. "My offer is more than fair," she said. $2,200 for a Riverside 2-bedroom is well below market. I've been generous." Daniel looked over his glasses. "And now you're increasing it to $6,800? "That's market rate," she replied smoothly. "I have comparable listings. She's been underpaying for years." The cousins leaned forward, hungry for figures. Aunt Linda sighed in admiration. "You're a saint for managing all that," she said to Allison. "It's so much work keeping track of properties." Allison smiled modestly. "Someone has to be responsible." Her gaze swept the room before landing back on me. "And frankly, Nora, this is for your own good. You can't live on discounts forever. You need to learn how the real world works." I could almost hear Grandma's pen tapping in the back of my mind, the rhythm she kept when she was done listening. Daniel lifted one document from his folder, scanning a line. "Just to confirm," he said, "you're asking your sister to sign a new lease immediately, correct?" "Yes," Allison said, "effective next month." He nodded as if making a note. "And if she refuses, then she'll need to vacate," she said flatly. "There's no reason she can't find another place within her means." The room murmured in approval. Dr. Renee nodded. "That's standard procedure," she said, like a witness for the prosecution. I met Allison's eyes steady now. "And you're doing this out of fairness," I said quietly. "Not frustration." "Don't twist my words," she snapped. "You've been subsidized long enough." Aunt Linda chimed in. "It's true, Nora. Most landlords would have raised it ages ago." The same phrase echoed from cousin to cousin: market rate, fairness, responsibility. I'd heard those words before, used to dress up something much smaller control. Daniel waited until they all finished, then looked at me. "Ms. Bennett," he said calmly, "you don't have to sign anything today. You're entitled to review all terms. And if you'd like, we can discuss your current lease structure privately." The word privately broke through the hum of conversation. Allison gave a quick, sarcastic smile. "Oh, we're doing this now." "You think a lawyer's going to intimidate me?" "No," I said. "I think he's going to clarify things." I could see the faintest flicker in her expression. Surprise or something close to it. For once, she wasn't leading the conversation. Daniel closed the folder and clasped his hands. "Before we continue," he said, "I should mention that all communication regarding this matter should go through my office from this point forward." Allison straightened. "Excuse me." "Standard procedure," he said simply. The room had gone very still. Kyle put down his phone. Uncle Mark cleared his throat, trying to bridge the silence. "Girls," he said gently, "maybe we should step back a bit. We don't need attorneys between family." But Allison wasn't about to lose the floor. "This isn't about lawyers," she said, her tone hard again. "It's about fairness. Nora knows her salary. She makes, $50,000 a year. She can't afford that apartment without me giving her a break." A few people nodded. I didn't correct her. I didn't mention the years of saving the quiet investment the account Grandma helped me start. I let her keep talking, building her case brick by brick, certain she was still on the winning side. Daniel stood silently beside me, flipping through papers without hurry. The confidence in his movement unsettled her. "You're wasting everyone's time," she said finally. "This meeting was supposed to settle Grandma's estate, not indulge your insecurities." Daniel looked up. "Then perhaps it's best we conclude the estate discussion first," he said smoothly, "and address the tenancy matter afterward. Privately." Aunt Linda perked up. "That seems reasonable." But Allison wasn't finished. "No," she said firmly. "Everyone should hear this. It's time we stop pretending my sister's situation is sustainable." The air in the room changed. Even those who'd been quiet leaned closer, as if drawn to the spark of conflict. Allison pulled up a chart from her briefcase and began lecturing like she was back in court numbers, graphs, comparison listings. "See, 8,000 for a 2-bedroom on the next block, 7,500 for a smaller one on Riverside. Even at 6,800, I'm giving her a discount." Each number was another nail in a coffin she didn't realize she was building for herself. "You're always saying you understand property values," she said, turning to me. "Well, here's your chance to live by them." My throat tightened, but I stayed quiet. Daniel leaned toward me, voice low. "Stay calm," he said. "Let her finish." She wasn't done. "This isn't punishment," she continued. "It's accountability. You've coasted long enough. Everyone in this family works hard. Mark built his practice. Renee runs a clinic. Melissa just got her promotion. You're still an assistant." She paused for effect. "You could do better if you tried." The word assistant hit its mark. Uncle Mark shifted in his chair. "Allison, that's enough." "Is it?" she said. "We've coddled her for years. Maybe some tough love will help." Her tone was measured, but her eyes gave her away. There was satisfaction in them. The kind Grandma used to warn me about, the kind that forgets humility. Daniel checked his watch, his voice steady. "Ms. Bennett, I'll need a copy of any prior agreements you have with your sister," he said quietly to me. "I brought them," I replied, pulling a folder from my bag. That caught Allison off guard. "You have copies?" "Of course," I said. "Grandma always told me to keep records. She didn't know what to do with that." "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "it's good you learned something from her." "I did," I said, matching her calm. "A lot, actually." The clock on the mantel ticked in the pause that followed, slow and deliberate. Daniel stood. "Perhaps it's best if we step into another room to review these." "No," Allison said again, more sharply this time. "We'll do it here. There's nothing to hide." I glanced around. 15 faces waited for my reaction, the silent expectation of another concession. Instead, I opened the folder and laid it beside Daniel's. "All right," I said. "Here." For a moment, the only sound was paper sliding across wood, Allison stared down, ready to pounce on any mistake. But Daniel didn't rush. He reviewed each line, cross-checked dates, and then looked up. "Interesting," he said softly. "You've been a model tenant, never missed a payment, no violations. That's rare." He turned to Allison. "And you've acknowledged her record every year. Of course," she said, her confidence returning. "She's been reliable, that's not the issue." Daniel nodded. "Understood." Then he looked at me. "When you're ready, we'll review the ownership details." Allison blinked. "Ownership!" Her voice sharpened on the word. "She doesn't own anything." "We'll see," Daniel said, still calm. "I just need a few more minutes to finalize the documentation." I caught Allison's expression change just slightly, but enough to know she'd felt something shift under her feet. It was small, invisible to the others, but I recognized it. Grandma used to say people sense a storm before they see it. The tension in the air was that first rumble on the horizon. Allison turned back to the room, determined to regain control. "We're getting off track," she said briskly. "Nora, you can have your lawyer look over the lease, but I need it signed by Friday. Otherwise, I'll start looking for new tenants." Her certainty was back, practiced and smooth. I gave a small nod, not an agreement, but acknowledgement. Daniel closed his folder. "We'll be in touch." Allison smiled thinly. "I'm sure you will." As he and I walked toward the door, I felt every gaze following us, the disbelief, the whisper of curiosity. Aunt Linda's voice floated after us, soft but cutting. "She's making a mistake," she said. "You can't fight family." Outside, the air felt cleaner. Daniel adjusted his briefcase. "You handled that well," he said quietly. "You didn't need to defend yourself." I looked back at the window where 15 silhouettes still hovered behind the curtains. "No," I said, "not yet." The next time we'd all sit in that room together, the words market rate would mean something entirely different. Daniel left quietly that afternoon, the click of the door sounding final. Inside, the family lingered talking in low tones that stopped whenever I passed. Aunt Linda moved between cousins, whispering her versions of events like she was collecting sympathy on Allison's behalf. I heard my name followed by the words lawyer and dramatic, then another round of soft laughter. Allison, perfectly composed again, poured herself a fresh glass of water, as though nothing had happened. Her eyes avoided mine, but her voice carried easily through the room. "She'll realize this was a mistake," she said to no one in particular. "We can't keep protecting her from reality." I gathered my papers, nodded to Uncle Mark, and slipped out the door before the echo of her sentence faded. Outside, the air smelled of wet pavement and early evening. I walked the few blocks back to the bus stop, clutching the folder Daniel had left with me. It contained nothing extraordinary, copies of leases, maintenance reports, payment records, but holding it gave me something tangible in a day that had spun off its axis. When I reached my apartment, the lights from the building across the street reflected in the window, each one steady and sure. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving, the papers spread in front of me like a map that led somewhere only I could see. For years, this apartment had been my anchor. I moved in right after Grandma's surgery when she needed help managing the upstairs tenants. I'd painted the walls myself pale cream with a faint scent of vanilla and fixed the baseboard heater when it clanked in winter. I paid rent on the first of every month, sliding the envelope into Allison's office mailbox at the firm, where her assistant always smiled politely and stacked it beside contracts that probably mattered more. I never missed a payment, never asked for an extension, and never called about small things, leaks, repairs, anything that could be handled with a trip to the hardware store. But inside this apartment were reminders of every time someone in my family called it a favor, like I was borrowing space that didn't belong to me. I made dinner that night, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, and let the television run for noise. Between commercials, I kept thinking about the phrase market rate, how easily it rolled off Allison's tongue. To her, numbers were weapons, not tools. Grandma had taught me differently. She'd say, "Every figure tells a story. You just have to know who's writing it." That was what led me into property management in the first place, the quiet logic behind walls and values, the way effort became equity if you had patience. What no one in that living room knew was how far that lesson had already taken me. 3 years earlier, after Grandma's health began to decline, she'd called me to her kitchen one Sunday morning. The smell of coffee was thick, and sunlight cut through the lace curtains, catching the lines around her eyes. She slid a business card across the table. "This is someone you can trust," she said. "He'll call you soon." The card belonged to a financial advisor she'd worked with for decades, a man who helped her set up quiet investments that no one else in the family knew about. "I want you to learn what I know," she told me. "Allison has her courtroom. You have this." When the advisor called weeks later, he explained that Grandma had set aside a small fund for me, enough for a down payment if I ever wanted to buy something modest. I remembered thanking him, promising I'd be careful. I used that money to invest in a minor share of a building we managed at my firm, and I studied everything that came with it: zoning codes, repair bids, tax credits. Within a year, I'd learned how to form an LLC. Within 2, I'd bought my own small duplex, renovated both units, and refinanced the loan. By the time Grandma passed, I had savings equity and quiet confidence. Allison assumed I was still living paycheck to paycheck because I never corrected her. I didn't need to. That night, I pulled a thin envelope from my desk drawer, the one with Grandma's handwriting on the flap. It contained a note she'd written before the stroke, folded neatly around a small brass key. "For when the time comes," the note said. The words had felt cryptic for years, but after the meeting that afternoon, they made perfect sense. I placed the key beside my laptop and opened my email to draft a message to Daniel. I kept it short, asking if we could meet the following week to review a few documents related to the building's ownership. His reply arrived within minutes. "Wednesday at 10 works. Bring everything you have." The next morning I left for work earlier than usual. The city felt heavier somehow, like the fog hadn't lifted from the night before. At the office, my coworkers greeted me with the same friendly nods as always. None of them knew about the tension brewing at home, and I intended to keep it that way. My supervisor, Jason Miles, stopped by my desk mid-morning. "I heard you were at the Bennett estate meeting yesterday," he said, carefully. "Everything all right?" He'd met my family once at a holiday party, and he knew enough not to pry. "It's being handled," I said. He smiled faintly. "You've got that calm look again. That's usually a good sign." By lunch, my phone buzzed with a new message from Allison. "We need to resolve this before it becomes embarrassing for both of us. I expect the signed lease by Friday." Her tone hadn't changed. She still thought of me as the sister who needed direction. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to Daniel and added a single line, "for documentation." That evening, I stopped by Mrs. Morales' apartment to drop off her rent receipt. She'd lived in the building since before I was born, her unit filled with family photos and the smell of cinnamon. "You look tired, Mija," she said, handing me a mug of tea. "Family meeting?" I nodded. "A long one." She smiled knowingly. "Families talk too much when money is near. But you're your grandmother's girl. You listen before you speak. That's worth more than gold." When I left her apartment, the hallway was quiet except for the hum of the radiator. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the warmth through the paint. This building had its flaws, but it was home. And it was time to remind everyone, including Allison, what home really meant. 2 days later, I met Daniel at his office downtown. The space was small but tidy, lined with thick folders and one framed photograph of his parents. He gestured for me to sit. "I reviewed the materials you sent," he said. "Interesting situation. Your sister's technically managing the property for the family trust, but—" He paused, flipping open a binder. "The trust sold a percentage of its stake 3 years ago." Quietly. "The transaction went through an LLC called Riverside Holdings." I nodded. "That's mine." He smiled slightly. "Then you already know what comes next." I did. I'd kept my ownership under wraps out of respect for Grandma's wish for peace. But peace had turned into silence, and silence had allowed assumptions to grow roots. "Are you ready for them to find out?" he asked. "Soon," I said. "But not yet. She's planning to raise my rent Friday. I'd like to let her deliver the news herself before we correct the record." Daniel closed the folder and leaned back. "You've been preparing for this, haven't you?" I thought of Grandma's note, the card she'd slipped across the table, the quiet faith she'd placed in me when no one else had. "Let's just say the time came," I said. That night, I returned home to a new envelope slid under my door. Inside was a formal lease typed on Allison's firm letterhead, complete with her signature already in place, and a line waiting for mine. The number 6800 glared from the page, printed twice for emphasis. Beneath it was a sticky note in her handwriting, "Friday, no excuses." I set the paper on the counter beside Grandma's key and stared at them both until the edges blurred. The following morning, I called Daniel. "Bring the ownership documents to Grandma's house," I said. "Friday afternoon. She wants everyone there again to finalize the estate. It seems fitting." He didn't ask questions. "I'll be there," he said simply. By the time Friday arrived, the lavender scent in Grandma's house had faded, replaced by the sterile smell of freshly printed paperwork. Allison was already there, surrounded by relatives, her confidence filling every corner. She looked up as I entered, that same polite smile fixed in place. "You brought the lease, I hope," she said. I placed the folder on the table and took my usual seat by the window. "I did," I said evenly. "And I brought something else." The words were quiet, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples hadn't reached her yet. But they would. Friday afternoon arrived cool and gray, the kind of day when the light stays the same from morning until dusk. I reached Grandma's house a few minutes before the others, letting myself in through the back door, like I used to when she was alive. The scent of lavender was almost gone now, replaced by the faint sweetness of polish from the furniture Allison had insisted we refinish after the funeral. I set my folder on the dining table, smoothing the worn lace runner Grandma had crocheted years ago. A knock sounded at the front door, crisp and deliberate. When I opened it, Daniel was there, briefcase in hand, coat damp from the drizzle. "Right on time," I said, quietly. He nodded once. "Everything's ready." "Everything," I answered. He stepped inside without another word, scanning the familiar room with professional calm. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table, adjusted his tie, and waited. Within 10 minutes, voices filled the hallway. Allison arrived with her usual poise, her heels striking sharp against the wood. Behind her came Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark, followed by Renee and Melissa. Kyle brought up the rear, holding his phone out as if documenting the moment. "We're all here," Allison said briskly, removing her coat. "Let's settle this quickly. Some of us have places to be." She looked at the folder in front of me, then at Daniel. "I assume this is your attorney?" she said, her tone clipped. "It is," I said. "He's here to make sure everything is handled properly." "Properly," she repeated like the word amused her. "Fine. Let's get this over with." She set her leather portfolio on the table and drew out several pages, already color-coded with her notes. "As discussed, Nora, this is your new lease, $6,800 per month beginning next cycle. You'll need to sign before the end of the day." Daniel didn't move. "Before we discuss that," he said, "there's another matter we need to address." Allison raised an eyebrow. "And that would be ownership," Daniel replied evenly. "It's come to our attention that there's been some confusion regarding the property's title." A murmur rippled through the room. Aunt Linda leaned toward Uncle Mark, whispering, "What does he mean by ownership?" Allison gave a dismissive laugh. "There's no confusion. The building is part of the Bennett Family Trust. I manage it, as everyone here knows." Daniel unlatched his briefcase and removed a thick envelope. "Until 3 years ago," he said. "That's when the trust sold its controlling interest." Allison blinked, thrown for a second, but recovered quickly. "Impossible. I would have approved any sale." "You did," Daniel said, sliding a document across the table. "It's all here. Your signature, the transaction records, the payment confirmation." The room went quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Allison glanced down, scanning the document, her expression tightening. "Riverside Holdings, LLC," she read aloud. "That's the buyer. I've never even heard of them." "You wouldn't have," Daniel said calmly. "It's privately held." She looked up, eyes narrowing. "Who owns it?" "My client," Daniel answered. "Nora Bennett." For a moment, nobody moved. Even Kyle stopped recording. Allison laughed again, but it was a thin, disbelieving sound. "You're joking." Daniel met her gaze. "No, ma'am. The sale was completed legally and in full compliance with state law. The trust sold its majority share 51% to Riverside Holdings 3 years ago. The remaining 49% was dissolved last year. As of today, Ms. Bennett is the sole owner of the building. Aunt Linda pressed a hand to her chest. That can't be right. Nora doesn't. She couldn't possibly afford. She could, Daniel said simply. She did. Allison stood so suddenly her chair scraped the floor. You manipulated Grandma, she said, voice rising. You took advantage when she was sick. I shook my head slowly. No one was manipulated. Grandma handled her affairs with the same precision she always did. She wanted the building cared for, not leveraged for control. Uncle Mark cleared his throat. Maybe we should all sit down, he said softly. But Allison was already pacing. This is absurd, she muttered. Riverside Holdings, who even comes up with a name like that? She turned back to me. You've been lying to everyone for years, pretending to be some struggling manager while collecting rent from your own family. I didn't collect from anyone, I said. You managed the payments. I stayed out of it like you wanted. Oh, that's convenient, she snapped. You let me handle everything while you hid behind an alias. I didn't hide, I said quietly. You just never looked. Daniel opened another folder. If I may, he said, there's additional documentation, renovation permits, tax assessments, and maintenance reports. Since the transfer, Ms. Bennett has overseen significant improvements to the property. Occupancy is at 98%, and the building's valuation has increased by nearly 50%. A stunned silence followed. Kyle let out a low whistle before Aunt Linda hushed him. Melissa frowned, looking between us like she couldn't decide which side was safer to stand on. You mean Nora owns the whole thing? She asked finally. That's what he said, Renee answered flatly. Allison's voice cut through again, sharper now. You planned this, she said. You waited for the perfect moment to humiliate me. No, I said. You planned this meeting. You raised my rent. I just showed up prepared. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate reply. Daniel handed her a second document. This, he said, is the updated property record verified by the county registrar. Feel free to confirm it yourself. She snatched the paper and began typing on her phone, probably searching the database. When she found it, the color drained from her face. It's true, she whispered. Riverside Holdings registered to Nora Bennett. Uncle Mark sat back, folding his hands. Well, he said slowly, I suppose that changes things. The cousins exchanged uneasy glances. Aunt Linda leaned forward, her tone softening. Nora, dear, you could have told us. We would have helped however we could. I met her eyes. Would you have? She hesitated, then looked away. Allison sank into her chair again, the papers limp in her hands. You think this makes you better than me? She said finally. Owning one building doesn't make you powerful. It's not about power, I said. It's about respect. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that came before. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Daniel gathered the remaining documents and placed them neatly back in his case. For clarity, he said, Ms. Bennett intends to continue honoring all existing leases, including family tenants. Adjustments, if any, will be handled according to market standards and legal timelines. Allison's eyes flashed. Market standards, she said bitterly. So what you're raising my rent now? Daniel didn't answer. I did. You asked me to live by market value, I said softly. It's only fair you do the same. Aunt Linda gasped. You can't mean that. I do, I said. Starting next cycle, your rent will reflect the neighborhood average just like you wanted for me. The notice will go out next week. Allison stared at me as if she didn't recognize the person in front of her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her almost. Then I thought of that lease, the number 6800 printed in bold, and the way she'd called it a lesson. Daniel closed his briefcase. If there are no further questions, he said, we'll take our leave. No one spoke. As he and I walked toward the door, the murmur of low voices rose behind us. Confusion, disbelief, the first cracks in years of certainty. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a light rain. The scent of wet earth drifted from Grandma's garden, the one she used to tend every Sunday morning. Daniel turned to me. You handled that well, he said quietly. I nodded, watching the light fade behind the windows. Inside that house, my sister was probably already drafting her next move, but for the first time, the field wasn't hers alone. and as I locked the door behind us, I knew the real reckoning hadn't even begun. The weekend after the confrontation passed in fragments. My phone stayed quiet, except for a single message from Daniel, confirming he'd filed the updated ownership record with the city clerk's office. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. By Sunday evening, the story had already begun circulating within the family, reshaped through whispers that bent the truth depending on who was talking. Some said I had tricked Allison. Others said Grandma had left me everything out of pity. None of them mentioned the work behind it, the nights spent managing repairs, or the years of saving every extra dollar. Monday morning brought a new kind of quiet. The tenants I'd seen for years greeted me differently in the hallways. There were polite nods, longer pauses, a tone of respect that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Morales stopped me by the mailboxes. "You handled that family meeting better than I could have, mija," she said. "Your grandmother would be proud." Her words landed softly, grounding me in the middle of everything that still felt unreal. By midweek, the calm broke. Allison called twice and left a third message that sounded more like a demand than an invitation. She wanted to discuss next steps privately. Her voice clipped and tired. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I asked Daniel to review her message. He sighed after listening. "She's trying to regain control," he said. "Don't meet her alone. If she insists, make it neutral ground." I agreed. Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived from Allison's firm official letterhead, her signature at the bottom. It accused me of conflict of interest, claiming I'd concealed ownership to manipulate her role as property manager. Daniel read it twice and shook his head. "It's bluster," he said. "She's angry, not strategic." Still, seeing my own sister's name on a legal letter hit differently than the tension in Grandma's living room. This wasn't family friction anymore. It was business. That night I found myself staring at the window across the courtyard where Allison's lights still burned late. She lived in the penthouse unit, 3 bedrooms, Parkview, the same one she'd lectured me about maintaining. Now it was mine to manage, and for the first time I saw it not as a symbol of distance between us, but as proof of how far the line had stretched. Friday morning I called her office. Her assistant Marcy hesitated before transferring me. "She's had a rough week," she whispered. "Half the firm's been talking." When Allison finally answered, her voice was sharp from exhaustion. "So you're calling to gloat," she said. "No," I replied. "To settle this." There was a long pause. Then she sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow, noon, my place." When I arrived the next day, the penthouse looked smaller than I remembered. The shades were drawn halfway, and stacks of legal folders lined the coffee table. Allison stood by the window, her usual confidence dulled around the edges. "I didn't expect you to actually show," she said. "I said I would." She turned, arms crossed. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone, Nora. My firm, our family. Do you even realize what that's done?" "I didn't embarrass you," I said quietly. "You announced something you didn't understand. I just told the truth." Her expression tightened. "Truth. You hid your ownership for years. You let me manage that building like it was still mine. It was never yours," I said. "You were managing it for Grandma. After she passed, you kept using it as leverage, and you never asked who actually owned what." She laughed once without humor. "You sound just like her." The air between us grew heavy. She picked up a file from the table and tossed it toward me. "Do you know how bad this looks at the firm? My partners think I can't separate personal life from business. Evan Brooks called me yesterday. He wants to review every case I've handled that touches family property." "That's not my fault," I said. "That's fallout from how you handled things." She walked closer, her voice lowering. "You think you've won something here, but you haven't. You can't handle running that building without me." I met her eyes. "I already am." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then turned away. "I suppose this means I'll be getting a rent increase notice soon?" "Yes," I said. "Market rate." Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "You're serious?" "You were," I replied. When she finally faced me, something in her had changed. The anger was still there, but beneath it was fatigue, the kind that comes from fighting battles you've already lost. "You really think this makes us even?" she asked. "It's not about being even," I said. "It's about being fair." Allison sat down the fight, leaving her posture. "I don't have $8,000 a month lying around," she said quietly. "I can't pay what the new rate will be." I waited. "Then you'll need to find somewhere else," I said. "I'll give you 60 days. She looked at me like she was trying to find the sister she used to know inside the woman standing across from her. "Grandma would hate this," she whispered. "Grandma hated injustice," I said. "Not accountability." I left the folder with her an itemized statement showing her rent adjustment and an offer for a payment plan if she needed time. She didn't touch it. As I reached the door, she spoke again, softer this time. "You've changed, Nora." "I had to," I said. "You made sure of that." When I stepped into the hallway, I exhaled for the first time in hours. The elevator doors opened, and for a moment I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls, steady, composed, not triumphant, but certain. 2 weeks later, Daniel called. "She's moving out," he said. "Gave notice this morning. Her new place is across town." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Let's schedule the inspection after she's gone." "Will do," he said. That evening I walked the property myself. The hallway lights glowed faintly, the hum of the heating system steady. I stopped outside her door, hearing only silence inside. It struck me how many times I'd stood there before, waiting for her approval or her instruction. This time I turned the key and opened it myself. The penthouse was nearly empty, except for a few boxes, and the echo of what used to be control. I walked through each room, checking the walls, the fixtures, the floors. The view from the window was breathtaking, buildings fading into dusk, city lights beginning to flicker. Somewhere below, the streetlights came on one by one, like small promises keeping time. In the kitchen, a single note sat on the counter in Allison's handwriting. "I'll send you the forwarding address. Please return the deposit when you can. A." There were no accusations, no parting shots, just formality. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. When I stepped back into the hallway, Mrs. Morales was waiting by the elevator. "I saw the movers," she said gently. "Family leaving." "Something like that," I said. "Changes needed to happen." She nodded. "Sometimes peace costs more than pride." Downstairs I walked out into the cool evening air. The street was quiet except for the sound of wind through the trees. I thought of Grandma again, how she'd warned me that silence had its own kind of power. For the first time I understood what she meant. The next morning, I sent Allison her formal rent adjustment notice and her refund minus the repair deduction Daniel had calculated for water damage in her unit. He confirmed receipt an hour later. The building ledger balanced perfectly. By the end of the week, new tenants toured the penthouse, an older couple relocating from Boston, both retired teachers. They admired the light, the space, the warmth. "Feels like home," the woman said. I smiled. That's what it's meant to be. As I walked them out, I glanced up toward the empty windows of the penthouse. The curtains were gone now, and sunlight poured in freely. It felt like the house was breathing again. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Allison. 2 words, "I'm sorry." I read it once, then turned off the light. Outside, the city was quiet, and for the first time in years, so was I. But I knew this wasn't the end, only the pause before the next chapter of what came after control was finally broken. The week Allison moved out, the building felt different, lighter somehow. For the first time in years, there wasn't tension drifting down from the top floor. Tenants who used to avoid small talk in the hallways began greeting each other again. Even the sound of the elevator seemed softer without her high heels clicking across the marble landing. I spent that first weekend walking through the property, checking minor repairs and noting where fresh paint was needed. It felt less like work and more like breathing. On Monday morning, Daniel met me in the office we kept in the building's ground floor suite. He set a stack of documents on my desk. "The vacancy notice for the penthouse is live," he said. "You've already got 6 applications." I raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" He smiled. "Good properties travel by word of mouth. People notice how you run things." We spent the next hour reviewing maintenance bids and new rental agreements. When he left, I stayed behind sorting through applications. Most were solid couples, a few professionals, one family relocating from Chicago. But one caught my attention. It was a handwritten letter from a woman named Margaret Chen, owner of a bakery on the West Side. She'd lived in the neighborhood for years, but lost her lease when her landlord sold the building. Her note ended with a simple line, "I'd like to rent from someone who understands what home means." 2 days later, she came by for a viewing. Margaret was warm and soft-spoken, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's work. She walked through each room with quiet appreciation, stopping by the window to look out at the park. "I used to walk my kids there after school," she said. "Feels familiar somehow." When she turned to me, her smile was small but steady. "You've kept this place well, Ms. Bennett. You can tell it's been cared for." By the time she left, I knew she'd be the right fit. The next day, we signed the lease over coffee at her bakery. She insisted on sending me home with a box of pastries, flaky croissants that filled the apartment with the scent of butter and vanilla. When I passed the penthouse later that evening, the moving truck had arrived. The hum of her laughter carried down the stairwell, soft and genuine. It was the first time that space had felt alive in years. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. I kept busy overseeing renovations on the first floor and updating the building's security system. Tenants came and went through the lobby, greeting me with nods that felt like quiet thanks. Even Aunt Linda stopped by one afternoon, bringing a tin of cookies as a peace offering. "You've done well, Nora," she said, standing in the lobby where sunlight poured across the tile. "It's nice seeing the family name mean something again." I thanked her, though the words carried a faint sting. By late February, Allison had kept her distance. She'd texted twice, once about her security deposit and once about forwarding her mail, but otherwise stayed silent. Then one morning, Daniel called. "You might want to see this," he said. He forwarded a link from a local business journal. The headline read, "Reed and Brooks, Partner Faces Internal Review After Family Dispute Goes Public." I clicked it open. The article was brief, but clear details from our meeting had leaked, and the firm's partners were reviewing Allison's conduct over potential conflict of interest concerns. Evan Brooks had given a short statement calling it an internal matter being handled professionally. Still, the implication was there. Her credibility had taken a hit. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading it. There was no satisfaction in it, just a quiet understanding that the balance had shifted again, only this time not by my doing. When I mentioned it to Daniel later, he nodded. "Public perception moves fast," he said. "But time will settle it. You don't need to involve yourself." I agreed, but part of me wondered how she was handling it. A week later, I got my answer. Allison showed up at the office without warning. She looked tired, less polished than I'd ever seen her. The sharp lines of her posture were gone. "I wanted to talk," she said. "Can we sit?" I gestured toward the chair across from me. For a while she said nothing. Then quietly, "The firm's reviewing my cases. They think I blurred lines between personal and professional boundaries." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I might lose my partnership." I listened without interrupting. "Evan said it's reversible," she added quickly. "But it depends on how I respond. They want to see if I can demonstrate judgment." When she looked up, her eyes met mine for the first time in months. "You could help," she said. "If you release a statement confirming this was just a misunderstanding, that the sale was legitimate and there's no dispute." "There isn't a dispute," I said gently. "But I won't pretend there wasn't manipulation. You tried to use me as an example of failure, Allison. That wasn't professional, it was personal." She flinched, then nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. "I was trying to prove something, and I went too far." For a moment, the room was quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock above the filing cabinet. She looked smaller sitting there, her voice barely above a breath. "I'm sorry, Nora." The apology hung in the air, fragile but real. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Finally, I said, "I'll tell the truth if anyone asks. That's all I can promise." She exhaled some of the tension, leaving her shoulders. "That's fair," she said. "Thank you." When she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. She paused in the doorway. "You've made this place beautiful," she said quietly. "Grandma would be proud." Then she was gone. That evening, I stopped by the penthouse to check on a maintenance request. Margaret was baking again. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the hallway. She opened the door before I could knock. "You're working late," she said. "Come in. I just pulled these from the oven." I accepted a small plate of pastries and watched her adjust a vase of fresh flowers on the counter. The apartment looked warm light bouncing off the walls, curtains drawn just enough to let in the city's glow. "You've turned it into a home," I said. She smiled. Places heal when they're cared for. As I left, I glanced back once more at the open door and the soft hum of life inside. The building felt whole again, balanced in a way it hadn't been since Grandma's time. Later that night, I got an email from Daniel. City assessment came in. Property's value rose 12% this quarter. Congratulations, Nora. I read it twice, then looked out at the skyline glowing through my window. It wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about peace, the quiet kind Grandma used to talk about, earned through patience and steady work. I closed my laptop, the faint smell of cinnamon still clinging to my jacket. Outside, the lights of the city flickered like steady breathing. And somewhere across town, I hoped Allison was finding her own version of calm. Because something in her eyes that afternoon told me she was finally starting to understand that success isn't about control. It's about what you build when the noise fades. The weeks ahead would prove whether that lesson would last. By early spring, the rhythm of life around the building had found its balance again. Mornings began with the faint smell of bread drifting down from the penthouse. Margaret had started delivering pastries to the tenants every Sunday. It became an unspoken ritual. People left notes of thanks on her door, small reminders that kindness could ripple through a place like sunlight across old tile. Work kept me busy, but not in the frantic way it used to. The city had rolled out a program for small property owners who maintained historical buildings, and Daniel suggested I apply. A few weeks later, I was meeting with a woman from the program named Laura Peters. She arrived with a clipboard, a bright smile, and the kind of steady energy that fills a room without taking it over. "Your records are meticulous," she said, flipping through her notes. "It's rare to see this level of care, especially in independent management." She walked the property with me, asking questions about the heating upgrades and the new safety system. When we reached the courtyard, she stopped and looked around. "You've built something special here," she said. "If the application clears, you'll qualify for both a preservation grant and tax reduction." Her words were measured but warm. "We're also looking for community partners to mentor new owners. I think you'd be perfect for that." For the first time, the idea of growth felt possible, not just for the building, but for me. I accepted the offer, agreeing to host a few workshops on property stewardship and tenant relations. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Grandma would have called it quiet work that lasts. A week later, Allison reached out again. Her message was short. "Can we meet? I'd like to talk face to face." I hesitated before answering. Daniel had warned me to keep communication professional, but something in her tone, simple, almost careful, made me agree. We met at a small cafe downtown away from the courthouse and her old office. She was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You look different," she said, studying me. "Happier." I smiled faintly. "The building's doing well." She nodded, then glanced down. "I read about your grant approval. Congratulations." The conversation moved slowly, like stepping onto ice after a thaw. She talked about leaving the firm. The review had ended with a suspension, not termination, but she'd chosen to resign instead. "I needed space," she said. For the first time, I didn't want to fight to stay somewhere that no longer fit. There was a trace of vulnerability in her voice I hadn't heard in years. I asked what she planned to do next. She hesitated, then laughed softly. "That's the question, isn't it? I've been teaching part-time at the community college. Real estate law. The students remind me of us, hungry, determined, and a little unsure." Her honesty caught me off guard. For once, there was no performance, no sharp edge beneath her words. "That sounds like a good change," I said. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "I hope so. And I wanted to thank you for not making things harder when everything fell apart." There was more behind that sentence than she said aloud, but it was enough. We sat quietly for a while, the sound of coffee cups and conversation filling the space between us. When we stood to leave, she reached into her bag and handed me an envelope. "For Grandma's foundation," she said. "I've been setting aside a portion from my classes. It's not much, but I wanted to contribute." Inside was a check, modest but meaningful. I looked up, unsure what to say. She smiled gently. She believed in second chances. Maybe it's time I start believing in them too. That night I returned home to the soft glow of the lobby lights and the faint hum of conversation drifting from the courtyard. Mrs. Morales was sitting on the bench knitting a scarf. "I saw your sister earlier," she said. "She looks different now. Quieter, like someone who's been listening." I nodded. Maybe she finally is. Over the next few months, I threw myself into the community program. Laura and I hosted workshops for new property owners, teaching them how to manage repairs and build trust with tenants. Margaret provided refreshments, her cinnamon rolls becoming a signature of every session. We even hosted one meeting in the courtyard, stringing up lights between the trees. The laughter that night reminded me of the neighborhood Grandma used to describe, the kind where people took care of each other. By summer, the building had become something of a small landmark in the district. The city sent a photographer to feature it in an article about preservation projects. When the piece was published, I recognized Allison's name among the acknowledgments. She'd written a short testimonial about ethical property management, quoting a line Grandma once said, "The value of a home is measured by the peace it brings." I reread that line several times. It didn't erase the past, but it marked something new. One afternoon, Laura stopped by with news. "The grant committee wants to expand the program," she said, smiling. "They'd like you to oversee the mentorship division next year." The offer stunned me. "You're the proof that ownership done right transforms communities," she added. "Think about it." That evening, I stood on the rooftop terrace watching the city lights spread across the horizon. From there, I could see the faint reflection of the park where Grandma used to walk, the same view she once called her quiet miracle. Below, laughter drifted up from the courtyard, Margaret sharing pastries, Kyle helping hang new planters, tenants trading stories like old friends. I thought about how far everything had come since that first meeting in Grandma's living room, the raised voices, the humiliation, the moment my sister called me naive for believing in fairness. Now the same family that once dismissed me was slowly finding its way back to decency, one small step at a time. Just before I went inside, my phone buzzed. A new message from Allison. "Dinner this Sunday, I'll cook this time." I smiled. Maybe some patterns really could be rewritten. When I turned off the light, the building glowed against the night sky, steady, alive, whole. It no longer felt like a burden or a battlefield. It felt like home in every sense of the word. And though the story wasn't finished yet, I could feel the final piece of it beginning to take shape. Dinner that Sunday felt different from any meal our family had shared in years. It wasn't the menu, roasted chicken garden salad and a pie Margaret had sent up earlier that day. It was the atmosphere. The usual tension that once filled our gatherings had softened into something quieter, something real. Allison arrived early, carrying a bottle of wine and a look of uncertainty I hadn't seen on her face since we were kids. We sat at the same dining table that used to host long, strained conversations about expectations and success. This time the talk came easily. Aunt Linda complimented the renovations. Kyle teased her for asking for seconds, and even Renee laughed at one of his jokes. When Allison finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I owe everyone an apology," she said. "Especially you, Nora. I let pride take over, and it cost me more than I realized." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then Uncle Mark reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Growth doesn't erase mistakes," he said, "but it sure shows who's willing to learn from them." Allison nodded, her eyes glistening. "I didn't add much. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need grand speeches. Just space. Just time." After dinner, she helped me clear the table. We stood at the sink side by side, washing dishes the way we used to when Grandma still lived upstairs. "You really turned the building around," she said quietly. "It's beautiful now." I glanced toward the window where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. "It's home," I said. "That's all I ever wanted it to be." She smiled faintly. "You did it. I'm proud of you." The words landed softly, but they carried years of unspoken meaning. I didn't need to say anything back. We both knew what it took to get here, the fights, the silence, the reckoning. Some stories don't end with perfect closure. They end with peace that's been earned one choice at a time. In the months that followed, the mentorship program grew faster than I expected. Laura and I partnered with local colleges, teaching property management courses to young adults who'd never imagined they could own anything beyond their own rent receipts. Margaret started a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing trade certifications, naming it after June Bennett. Watching her speak at the first award ceremony felt like watching the building itself come full circle, a space once filled with resentment, now echoing with possibility. Allison attended that event sitting quietly in the back row. Afterward, she handed me a small framed photo of Grandma taken in the courtyard years ago. "She'd be proud of this," she said. "Proud of you?" I smiled. "Of both of us," I replied. She didn't argue. By fall, the city recognized the building as a heritage property. A brass plaque was mounted by the front door, engraved with Grandma's favorite phrase, "The value of a home is measured by the peace it brings." Every time I walked past it, I felt her presence steady patient, reminding me that quiet victories often speak loudest. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after that. Allison still had moments of defensiveness, and I still caught myself flinching at old memories. But our conversations grew easier, less about who was right, and more about how to keep moving forward. Sometimes we met for coffee near the park, sometimes for long walks in silence. The distance between us didn't vanish overnight, but it narrowed enough for understanding to cross. One evening near the end of the year, I walked the halls of the building alone. The smell of cinnamon drifted from Margaret's apartment laughter, floated from Mrs. Morales' television, and the soft hum of the elevator echoed through the air. It struck me how much had changed, not just in the structure, but in me. I used to think strength meant proving people wrong. Now I knew it was about staying kind, even when you could be cruel. When I reached the rooftop terrace, the city stretched out beneath me, calm and bright. I thought about Grandma's last lesson, the one she'd tucked into every conversation without ever naming it. Success wasn't about having more. It was about standing firm without bitterness, about knowing your worth long before anyone else recognized it. That's what I carried forward, the steady rhythm of resilience, the quiet power of boundaries, and the understanding that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes when new tenants move in, they ask about the plaque by the door. I tell them it's more than a quote, it's a promise. A reminder that peace is something you build brick by brick every day. You choose respect over resentment. So if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or made to feel small, remember this: you don't need to fight to be seen. Just keep building quietly until your work speaks for itself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need the same reminder that the best revenge isn't loud or cruel. It's living with grace, standing tall, and knowing that peace is the truest kind of success.